You believed in love conquering all. You believed in the redemption of monsters through kindness. You believed that beneath the frightening exterior lay a gentle soul waiting to be discovered. Disney taught you this lie. Gabrielle Suzanne Barbot de Villeneuve whispered it to you in 1740. But the truth is carved in bone and written in blood, and it begins with the sound of an iron cage door closing on a 10-year-old boy whose only crime was the texture of his skin. The beast was real. His name was Petrus Gonsalvus. He was not cursed by magic. He was cursed by history. The year is 1537, and the island of Tenerife still bleeds. The Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands has only recently concluded its century of systematic annihilation. The Guanche people, descendants of North African Berbers who had lived on these volcanic islands for over 1,000 years, have been erased with the methodical precision that Europe would later perfect in the Americas. Between 1402 and 1496, Castilian conquistadors waged campaigns that combined military slaughter with something far more insidious, the complete destruction of a civilization's soul. The statistics are carved in ledgers and shipping manifests. At least 643 Guanches documented as sold into slavery in Valencia, Seville, Barcelona, Ibiza, but numbers cannot capture the texture of genocide. They cannot describe the smell of burning villages or the sound of children being torn from their mothers' arms. They cannot convey the particular horror of watching your language die on your tongue, of seeing your sacred sites converted to churches, of learning that your body is no longer your own. By 1537, Tenerife stinks of colonialism. The acrid smoke from sugarcane processing plants burns the nostrils. Massive operations worked by enslaved labor, where human beings are ground down as efficiently as the cane itself. The salt marshes reek of rotting fish, left to cure in the brutal Atlantic heat. Unpaved streets run with filth and waste, creating rivers of sewage that pool in the volcanic rock. Plague moves through the surviving Guanche communities like a tide, carrying away the old, the young, the already weakened by decades of systematic starvation. The Spanish have built their paradise on a foundation of corpses. Their churches rise where Guanche temples once stood. Their plantations sprawl across land that was once sacred. Their children play in courtyards where entire bloodlines were extinguished. And in this world of absolute dehumanization, a child is born whose body will mark him for a lifetime of exploitation. Petrus Gonsalvus enters this world around 1537, possibly to a family of Guanche descent, possibly to survivors who have learned to hide their heritage, to speak Spanish instead of their native tongue, to bow their heads and accept the new order. His birth is not recorded with celebration. Children born with visible differences, excessive hair covering the face and body, features that deviate from European norms, are marked from their first breath. They are omens, curiosities, potential commodities. The condition that covers Petrus's body with hair is not magic. It is hypertrichosis, a genetic variation that occurs perhaps once in every billion births. That in 1537 Tenerife, scientific understanding is centuries away. What matters is spectacle. What matters is the market value of difference. What matters is that somewhere in the Spanish colonial administration, someone recognizes that this child's body could be currency. The transaction happens when Petrus is approximately 10 years old. He is not sold. That would be too crude, too obvious. He is gifted from the Canary Islands to the French court of King Henry II, a diplomatic present that demonstrates the exotic reaches of Spanish colonial power. The paperwork describes him as a curiosity, a wonder, a specimen of the strange peoples found in distant lands. His name is not mentioned, his family is not consulted, his consent is not considered. The journey from Tenerife to France is recorded only in fragments, but the destination is documented with brutal clarity. Petrus arrives at the Palace of Fontainebleau, one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, and is immediately placed in an iron cage. The metallic scrape of that cage door closing echoes through the centuries, the sound of the lock turning heavy, final, absolute, marks the moment when a child becomes a specimen. He is fed raw meat and animal feed, the rotting flesh mixed with grain dust and mold, a deliberate choice designed to reinforce that he is something less than human. The courtiers who gather to observe him do not see a frightened child, they see confirmation of their own superiority, proof that civilization has boundaries, evidence that some bodies exist solely for their entertainment. The Palace of Fontainebleau in the 1540s is not the romantic setting of fairy tales. It is a labyrinth of intrigue, where whispered accusations can mean death, where poison moves through the wine as easily as gossip moves through the corridors. The air is thick with the acrid chemical smell of cosmetics and perfume, layered desperately thick to mask the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and endemic disease. Thousands of people live in close quarters without adequate sanitation. Water is contaminated, food spoils in the heat. Syphilis, dysentery, plague, and tuberculosis move through the court with seasonal regularity. Children die constantly. Infant mortality approaches 50%. Those who survive learn early that their value depends entirely on their utility to power. Dwarves are kept as entertainment. Giants are displayed as wonders. People from distant lands are collected like exotic animals. The court of Henry II maintains a menagerie of human curiosities, and Petrus has become its newest acquisition. But Catherine de Medici, Henry's queen, sees something more complex in the hairy child from the Canaries. Catherine is not a romantic. She is one of history's most calculating women, a survivor who has navigated French court politics through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an absolute understanding that power requires the systematic exploitation of weakness. When she looks at Petrus, she does not see a beast to be pitied. She sees an opportunity for an experiment. The experiment is simple in its cruelty. What happens when you force a monster to live as a man? Can civilization be imposed on the savage? Can breeding between the monstrous and the normal produce predictable results? Catherine orders that Petrus be removed from his cage, educated, dressed in fine clothing, taught to behave as a nobleman. But this is not kindness. This is scientific inquiry conducted on a living human being without his consent. The texture of silk and brocade against his hair-covered skin becomes a daily reminder of the lie he is forced to live. The expensive fabrics mark him as noble, but the hair beneath reveals the artifice of that nobility. He learns French, Latin, courtly manners, the elaborate dance of European civilization. But every conversation stops when he enters a room. Every smile is forced. Every interaction is colored by the knowledge that he is performing humanity rather than simply being human. The cold touch of physicians' hands during examination becomes routine. They move across his body clinically, without compassion, reducing him to measurements, to descriptions, to scientific notation. His hair is counted, categorized, compared to animal fur. His features are documented with the same detachment used for botanical specimens. His body is not his own. It is data, evidence, proof of European theories about the hierarchy of human development. And then comes the marriage. Catherine de Medici arranges for Petrus to marry Catherine Raphaelin, a servant in the court. The bride's perfume on their wedding day mixes with the smell of her fierce sweat, creating a sickly sweet scent that hangs in the air like incense. Catherine Raphaelin has been told nothing about her future husband, except that the queen commands the union. When she sees Petrus for the first time, her revulsion is palpable, her terror immediate and complete. This is not the love story that fairy tales would later claim. This is a psychological experiment, orchestrated by a woman who wants to see if a beast man can produce beast children. The marriage bed becomes a laboratory. The children who result, 7 in total, 4 of whom inherit their father's hypertrichosis, become specimens before they can walk. The sound of those children crying echoes through the palace corridors. Their tears are not just from pain or hunger, they are from the dawning realization that their bodies make them property, that they will be displayed and studied and documented throughout their lives, that they are not children but experiments, not humans but curiosities, not individuals but evidence in someone else's theory about the nature of monstrosity. The woman who would destroy Petrus Gonsalvus was forged in the furnace of systematic humiliation. Catherine de Medici arrived in France in 1533 as damaged goods, a 14-year-old Italian banking heiress, married to a prince who despised her. For 10 years, her womb remained empty while Henry II conducted his affair with Diane de Poitiers in full view of the court. 10 years of monthly bleeding that announced her failure to every courtier, every servant, every ambassador who whispered about the barren Italian queen. 10 years of watching her husband's mistress receive the gifts, the attention, the respect that should have been hers. When Catherine finally conceived, it was too late. Henry had already learned to live without her. The children she bore, future kings of France, could not repair the psychological fractures carved into her psyche during those first brutal years. She had learned that power was the only currency that mattered, that mercy was weakness, that human beings were tools to be manipulated or discarded. By the time Henry II died on July 10, 1559, his skull pierced by Gabriel de Montgomery's splintered lance, wooden shards driven deep into his right eye socket, causing a brain infection that killed him over 10 days of fevered agony. Catherine had calcified into something inhuman. The transformation was complete. At 40 years old, she seized the regency with the cold efficiency of a woman who had spent decades planning her revenge against a world that had humiliated her. What followed was not governance, but systematic sadism dressed as statecraft. On August 24, 1572, she orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, unleashing Catholic mobs against Huguenot Protestants in Paris. The killing began at dawn. Huguenots were dragged from their beds, their throats cut in their nightclothes. Children were thrown from windows. Pregnant women were disemboweled. The Seine ran red for 3 days as bodies clogged the river. Estimates range from 10,000 to 70,000 dead across France. Catherine watched from her palace window as the screams echoed through the streets. This was not religious fervor. This was the methodical application of trauma as policy. Catherine had learned that the world was divided into those who inflict pain and those who suffer it, and she had chosen her side. When her own daughter Margot displayed sexual autonomy that Catherine deemed shameful, she had her kidnapped and imprisoned in a fortress in southwest France for 17 years. Her own child became another tool to be controlled, another body to be manipulated. But Catherine's interest in Petrus Gonsalvus revealed something more disturbing than political cruelty. It revealed scientific sadism, the clinical application of human suffering for intellectual curiosity. When Henry II died, Petrus lost his protector. He became Catherine's property, and Catherine had a question that fascinated her. What would happen if her hairy beast married a beautiful woman? Would they produce beast children? This was not romance. It was a breeding experiment, conducted with the methodical precision of a woman who had learned to treat human beings as laboratory specimens. Catherine's methodology was deliberately cruel. She selected Catherine Raphaelin, the young daughter of a court servant, without informing her of Petrus's appearance. The girl was not warned, not prepared, not given the basic courtesy of informed consent. She was ambushed on her wedding day, presented with a husband whose face was covered in hair, whose body violated every norm of human appearance she had been taught to expect. Historical accounts report that Catherine Raphaelin fainted when she saw Petrus for the first time. Catherine de Medici found this amusing. The terror of a young woman confronted with the unknown became entertainment for a queen who had learned to find pleasure in the suffering of others. The real villain was not supernatural but systemic, a society that had already decided Petrus was not fully human, governed by a woman who had learned to weaponize that dehumanization for her own twisted purposes. Catherine de Medici was not born evil. She was manufactured by a system that taught her that power meant the right to use other people's bodies as instruments of her will. The physical reality of Petrus Gonsalvus's condition was relentless and inescapable. He suffered from congenital hypertrichosis universal, known today as Ambras syndrome, a genetic mutation so rare that fewer than 50 cases have been documented in modern medical history. In the 16th century, Petrus represented the first definitively recorded instance of this condition in European medical literature, making him not just a curiosity, but a specimen for an age obsessed with cataloging the boundaries of human possibility. The condition manifested as a complete covering of fine, dark lanugo hair across his entire body. This was not the coarse terminal hair of normal human growth, but the downy, almost silk-like hair that covers human fetuses in the womb and is typically shed before birth. In Petrus's case, this fetal hair never stopped growing. It covered his scalp, his face, his ears, his shoulders, his back, his arms, his legs. Every inch of visible skin disappeared beneath a layer of dark fur that grew continuously throughout his lifetime. The hair on his face was particularly dense, creating what contemporary observers described as a furry mask that obscured his human features. His eyes peered out from behind this natural veil, but his nose, his mouth, his cheeks were hidden beneath hair that grew in whorls and patterns that followed the contours of his skull. The hair grew from his ear canals, making hearing difficult. It grew from his eyelids, creating a constant irritation. It grew from his nostrils, affecting his breathing. Every basic human function was complicated by the presence of hair where hair should not exist. Associated with the hypertrichosis were facial anomalies that further distorted his appearance. His face took on a triangular coarsened structure. The bones themselves seemed to have developed differently, creating a skull shape that deviated from normal human proportions. His nasal tip was bulbous and enlarged. His palpable fissures, the openings between his eyelids, were elongated, giving his eyes an almost almond-shaped appearance that contemporary observers found unsettling. His dental development was irregular. Some accounts mention delayed tooth eruption and missing teeth that left gaps in his smile. The condition caused no pain, no systemic disease, no shortened lifespan. The hair was not infected or disease. It was simply hair, growing where hair should not grow. But in a society that equated physical beauty with moral worth, that saw the human form as a reflection of divine order, this purely cosmetic difference became a death sentence to his humanity. The psychological torture was systematic and scientific. When Felix Platter, the renowned Swiss physician, examined members of the Gonsalvus family in Basel in 1582, he classified them in his medical casebooks, not under human conditions, but under people who have unwanted hair, grouping them with cosmetic abnormalities, rather than recognizing them as patients deserving of medical compassion. Platter's examination was thorough and invasive. He measured their bodies, documented the patterns of hair growth, described the texture and color of their hair with the clinical detachment of a botanist cataloging plant specimens. Ulisse Aldrovandi, the Bolognese naturalist, went further. When he examined 8-year-old Tognina Gonsalvus in Bologna, he described her in his Historia Monstrorum as a 20-year-old woman with a hairy head who resembles an ape. The child became data. Her childhood became documentation. Aldrovandi placed the entire Gonsalvus family in his compendium of monstrous beings, categorized alongside malformed animals and botanical curiosities. This was the science of the age, the systematic reduction of human difference to spectacle, the transformation of living people into museum specimens. 4 of Petrus's 7 children inherited the condition: his sons Enrico and Orazio, and his daughters Tognina and Charlotte. These children grew up knowing that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the courts that housed them, the physicians who examined them, the artists who painted them, and the naturalists who documented them. They were born into captivity, born as experiments, born into a world that had already decided what they were before they could speak their first words. The medical examinations became ritualized humiliation. When the family traveled through Europe between 1581 and 1595, they were examined by naturalists, anatomists, and physicians in every major court. These examinations were not private medical consultations, but public demonstrations of scientific curiosity. The family was required to undress, to display their bodies, to submit to measurements and documentation. Physicians ran their hands over the children's hair-covered skin, documenting the texture, the density, the patterns of growth. They measured the length of the hair, noted its color variations, described its response to different climates and seasons. The children learned that their bodies were not their own. They learned that privacy was not a right they possessed. They learned that their physical difference made them valuable as specimens but worthless as human beings. Tognina, painted by Lavinia Fontana around 1590, appears in the portrait wearing fine courtly dress and holding a letter that demonstrates her literacy. Fontana's painting was an attempt to portray her as human rather than monster, but this humanity was always conditional, always contingent on her willingness to be displayed. The trauma embedded in this systematic observation was profound and generational. Petrus himself developed elaborate coping mechanisms. He became educated, eloquent, cultured. He learned Latin, the language of power and scholarship. He became a storyteller to King Charles IX. He taught law at the Sorbonne. He dressed in magnificent robes that marked his status as a court favorite. But this transcendence was always precarious, always dependent on his willingness to perform humanity for an audience that fundamentally denied it. His children had no such escape. They were born into a world that had already categorized them as monsters. They grew up knowing that their value lay not in their thoughts, their feelings, or their potential contributions to society, but in their willingness to submit to examination, documentation, and display. They were living proof of their father's monstrosity, evidence of Catherine de Medici's breeding experiment, specimens in a collection of human curiosities that would be passed down through European courts like valuable artworks or exotic animals. The horror was not in their appearance, but in the systematic dehumanization that their appearance enabled, a society that had learned to see human difference as entertainment, scientific curiosity as justification for cruelty, and the human body as property to be owned, studied, and displayed at will. The morning of October 15th, 1618, arrived without ceremony in Capodimonte. The sun rose over the Italian hills, as it had for millennia, indifferent to the dying man in the small chamber overlooking the gardens. Petrus Gonsalvus lay in his bed, 81 years old, his breathing shallow and labored. The hair that had defined his entire existence, the curse that had made him famous, the difference that had stripped him of his humanity, now grew thin and gray across his weathered face. By noon, the servants had gathered outside his door, whispering among themselves. They had known him for years, had served him his meals, had cleaned his chambers, had grown accustomed to his appearance. Yet even now, even as he lay dying, they could not quite decide what he was. Was he the learned gentleman who spoke 4 languages and could recite Cicero from memory? Or was he the beast who had been displayed in courts across Europe, the curiosity who had been painted and examined and documented like a rare animal? The question would be answered by sunset. When Petrus Gonsalvus drew his final breath that evening, the church bells of Capodimonte remained silent. No priest was summoned to perform the last rites. No funeral mass was arranged. No grave was dug in the consecrated ground of the local cemetery. The man who had spent 71 years proving his humanity, who had mastered the languages of civilization, who had raised 7 children and loved 1 woman for 45 years, was denied the most basic recognition that Renaissance society granted to the human dead. His body was disposed of without record. His grave, if it can be called that, was unmarked. The earth that received him was unconsecrated, reserved for animals and apostates, and those deemed unworthy of Christian burial. In death, as in life, Petrus Gonsalvus was classified as something other than human. The servants who had known him, who had witnessed his gentleness and his dignity, said nothing. The local priest, who might have intervened, chose not to. The authorities who could have insisted on proper burial looked the other way. This was not cruelty. This was simply the natural order of things. Some people were human, and some were not, and the difference was written on their skin, in their hair, in the shape of their bodies. Petrus had spent 8 decades challenging this classification, and in the end it had defeated him completely. The tragedy was not that he died. The tragedy was that even in death, the world refused to acknowledge what he had been all along. But the story does not end with his burial. It ends 122 years later, in 1740, when Gabrielle Suzanne Barbaud de Villeneuve published a fairy tale called Beauty and the Beast. The connection is not explicit in her text. She makes no reference to Petrus Gonsalvus, no acknowledgement of the real man whose life had inspired the archetype. But the bones of his story are there, transformed and sanitized and made palatable for polite society. In Villeneuve's tale, the beast is not an indigenous man stolen from his homeland and displayed as a curiosity. He is a cursed prince, noble by birth, whose monstrosity is temporary and reversible. The beauty is not a young woman forced into marriage as part of a eugenics experiment. She is a willing participant in a love story, capable of seeing past appearances to the noble heart beneath. The transformation at the end is not the slow, painful process of a human being earning recognition of his humanity through extraordinary accomplishment. It is magic, instant, complete, and morally satisfying. The fairy tale tells us that love conquers all, that beauty can see past monstrosity, that redemption is possible for even the most cursed among us. It is a beautiful story. It is also a lie. The truth is that Petrus Gonsalvus was never cursed. He was never a beast. He was never waiting for redemption or transformation. He was already human, intelligent, cultured, dignified, capable of love and worthy of respect. The monstrosity was not in his appearance. It was in a world that decided his appearance made him less than human, and then spent centuries refining the systems that would enforce that classification. The fairy tale inverts the moral entirely. It suggests that the problem is the beast's ugliness, not the world's cruelty. It implies that if only beauty can learn to love the monster, then everything will be resolved. But Petrus did not need to be loved, despite his appearance. He needed to be recognized as human because of his humanity. The problem was never his hair. It was a civilization that had decided hair could disqualify someone from personhood. This is why we tell fairy tales, not to preserve truth, but to bury it, not to honor the victims of our cruelty, but to transform their suffering into entertainment, not to learn from our mistakes, but to convince ourselves that we are capable of redemption, that our love can overcome the monstrosity we create. Every time we watch Beauty and the Beast, we participate in the final erasure of Petrus Gonsalvus. We celebrate a story that transforms his dehumanization into romance, his trauma into moral instruction, his reality into fantasy. We tell ourselves that we are learning about looking past appearances, about recognizing inner beauty, about the power of love to transform. But what we are really learning is how to bury the truth so deep that we forget it ever existed. The Renaissance was an age of humanism, we are told, an age of enlightenment, of the rediscovery of human dignity, of the elevation of human potential. Yet, it was also an age in which a 10-year-old boy could be caged like an animal, fed raw meat, and displayed as a curiosity, and the entire apparatus of civilization, the church, the crown, the court, medicine, art, literature, would conspire to normalize this treatment. The same culture that produced Michelangelo's David and Leonardo's Vitruvian Man also produced the iron cage that held Petrus Gonsalvus. This is not a contradiction. This is the essence of human civilization. The simultaneous capacity for transcendent beauty and systematic cruelty, often directed at the same object, often by the same people. We create art that celebrates human dignity, while building institutions that destroy it. We write philosophy about the inherent worth of all people, while constructing elaborate justifications for treating some people as less than human. We tell stories about love conquering all, while perpetuating systems that make love conditional on conformity. Petrus Gonsalvus understood this contradiction intimately. He lived it every day for 71 years. He was educated by the same people who caged him, celebrated by the same courts that displayed him, painted by the same artists who reduced him to a curiosity. He was simultaneously the subject and the object, the human and the specimen, the gentleman and the beast. This was not a paradox to be resolved. It was the permanent condition of his existence. The genius of the fairy tale is that it resolves this paradox through narrative magic. In the story, the beast becomes human through love, The curse is broken. The transformation is complete. But Petrus was already human. He did not need to be transformed. He needed to be recognized. The curse was not on him. It was on a world that had forgotten how to see humanity, in difference, dignity, in disability, personhood, in those who did not conform to narrow definitions of normal. We have not learned from Petrus Gonsalvus. We have only learned to tell more sophisticated stories about our cruelty, to embed it deeper in our culture, to make it invisible by transforming it into entertainment. We have become masters of the art of burying truth, while telling stories, of erasing history, while claiming to preserve it, of perpetuating injustice, while congratulating ourselves on our moral progress. The real horror of the Beauty and the Beast story is not that it misrepresents the facts of Petrus's life. The real horror is that it perfectly represents the mechanism by which we transform our victims into our heroes, our cruelty into our compassion, our failures into our triumphs. We take the man we destroyed and make him the monster we redeemed. We take the humanity we refuse to recognize and make it the love story we tell our children. This is how civilization perpetuates itself, not through honest reckoning with its crimes, but through the endless transformation of those crimes into myths of redemption. We do not progress morally across time. We simply become more eloquent in our justifications, more sophisticated in our denials, more artistic in our erasures. Petrus Gonsalvus died without Christian burial, without recognition as fully human, without justice. But we have given him something else: immortality as a fairy tale character, eternal life as a symbol of transformation, permanent residence in our collective unconscious, as the beast who becomes human through love. It is the cruelest gift imaginable. We have made him immortal by erasing everything that made him mortal. We have preserved his story by destroying his truth. We have honored his memory by forgetting his reality. And we call this progress. We call this civilization. We call this love. The sun that rose over Capodimonte on October 15th, 1618, set on a world that had learned nothing from the life of Petrus Gonsalvus. The sun that rises today sets on a world that has learned nothing still. We have simply become more sophisticated in our ignorance, more artistic in our cruelty, more eloquent in our lies. We are all beauty, we are all beast, and we are all the world that made them both.